The alien alliance eliminated Earth's frontier colonies. They didn't expect humanity's long-prepared response. The message came through at 0317 hours, Station Standard Time. Not a distress call. Not a mayday. Not even a scrambled emergency burst from a colony's backup transmitter. Just silence. The specific, structured kind of silence that automated relay networks generate when every node in a chain goes dark at once. Commander Yara Osei was the first senior officer to read the diagnostic report. She read it twice slowly before she called anyone. 17 relay stations. 11 frontier colonies. Gone from the network in a cascade that took approximately 4 hours to complete, starting from the outer edge of the Kepler reach and moving inward, colony by colony, like someone methodically turning off lights in a corridor. She didn't use the word attack in her initial report. She used the word event. That restraint would later be seen as either extraordinary discipline or the calm of someone who already understood the magnitude of what had happened and needed a few minutes to decide how to carry it. The Kepler Reach colonies were humanity's outermost settlements, a loose arc of 11 worlds and 6 deep space habitats strung along a resource-rich stellar corridor roughly 340 light-years from Earth. They were not glamorous. They were mining operations, gas extraction platforms, long-haul agricultural stations producing grain and protein cultures for the inner systems. About 1.2 million people in total. Farmers, engineers, processing technicians, their families. People who had signed multi-decade contracts because the pay was good and the isolation was manageable. They had been out there for 60 years. Humanity had known, for approximately 40 of those 60 years, that they were not alone in that corridor. The first confirmed contact had not been dramatic. A survey drone operating near the Kepler Reach's far edge had returned imagery of a structure, clearly artificial, clearly not human, orbiting a brown dwarf that the charts listed as uninhabited. The structure was enormous. Later analysis estimated it at roughly 4 kilometers across its longest axis, built from materials that did not match any naturally occurring formation in the system. What followed was 40 years of the most careful, most deliberate diplomatic engagement in human history. The Veth, as xenolinguists eventually named them, borrowing from a root word in one of their detected signal patterns, were not a single species but a coalition. An alliance of at least 7 distinct civilizations that had, over some period estimated at several thousand years, consolidated their interests across a broad region of the Kepler corridor and beyond. They were old. They were organized. And they had watched humanity's expansion into the reach with what could only be described, in hindsight, as patient calculation. 40 years of contact. Slow, difficult, imperfect translation. Exchange of mathematical frameworks. Partial maps. Cautious proximity tests. Nothing that anyone would call friendship, but something that had seemed, to the diplomatic teams, like the beginning of a workable relationship. The relay silence changed that assessment in a single night. By 0600 hours, Commander Osei had woken the station's senior staff. By 0800, she had transmitted a priority report to the Colonial Defense Council on Earth and the 4 intersystem fleet hubs. By noon, the first reconnaissance probes were being prepared for launch toward the reach's edge. Small, fast, equipped only with passive sensors and a one-way transmission burst capacity. They would not arrive for 11 days. In those 11 days, humanity's institutional response moved with a speed that surprised even those inside the system. Emergency sessions. Command restructuring. The activation of what military planners had spent decades developing but had never expected to use. Because here is what most people did not know, what the public had never been told and what the Veth had certainly not been informed of, humanity had been building something in the quiet for a very long time. Not out of aggression. Not because anyone expected war. But because the people responsible for the survival of 1.2 million citizens on the frontier, and 14 billion more in the inner systems, had understood something fundamental about the nature of being a young civilization in a corridor that was already occupied. You don't wait to be ready. You get ready while you still have time. You do it quietly. You do it thoroughly. And you hope to God you never need it. The probes launched at 1,400 hours on the second day. The mood in fleet operations was not panic. It was not even urgency in the conventional sense. It was the feeling of a long calculation finally reaching its answer. Senior Fleet Admiral Keanu Makua, 58 years old, 30 years in uniform, the architect of what was officially called the Horizon Contingency Framework, looked at the relay silence map and said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. Then he said, "Begin Horizon activation. Priority sequence. And get me aligned to the Council." His aide, Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, asked the question that would later be quoted in 100 historical accounts of that morning, "Admiral, what do you think happened out there?" Makoa didn't look away from the map. "I think they made a decision. And I think they made it without understanding what we've spent 40 years building." He paused. "We're about to show them." In the Kepler reach, 340 light-years away, 11 worlds were dark and still. Whatever had moved through them had done so with precision, not the chaotic destruction of something angry, but the deliberate, clinical efficiency of something that wanted the corridor cleared. The Veth Alliance had made a calculation. They had not made it correctly. The Horizon Contingency Framework did not begin with a war plan. It began with a question asked in a small conference room at the Colonial Defense Council's Research Annex, 41 years before the Kepler reach went silent. The question was posed by a civilian economist named Dr. Fatima al-Rashidi, who had been contracted to model resource dependency across humanity's nascent interstellar settlements. Her question was, what happens to the inner systems if the frontier is cut off? The answer she produced over the following 18 months was deeply uncomfortable. The frontier colonies, despite their modest population, were responsible for approximately 34% of humanity's rare element extraction, a significant portion of its long-chain organic synthesis capacity, and, perhaps most critically, 12 of the 19 relay nodes that formed the backbone of interstellar communications infrastructure. Lose the frontier even temporarily and the inner systems would not collapse. But they would be significantly weakened, communicationally isolated in important ways, and, this was the part that caught the attention of Fleet Command, unable to project power effectively into the outer corridor for a recovery period estimated at 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years of strategic blindness and limited reach. Against a potential adversary that had been in the corridor for millennia. Dr. al-Rashidi presented her findings to a closed session of the Colonial Defense Council. She was thanked, compensated, and asked to continue her research under a security classification she had not previously held. 3 months later, Fleet Admiral Makoa, then a captain newly assigned to long-range strategic planning, was handed her report and told to develop a response framework. He spent 6 months reading it. Then he spent the next 34 years building what it implied. The Horizon Contingency was not a single system or a single plan. It was a layered architecture of capabilities, positioned and maintained across the inner systems and the mid-corridor in ways that, individually, seemed unremarkable. A logistics depot here. A deep space manufacturing platform there. Relay hardening upgrades on older stations. A dispersed network of automated sensor platforms positioned along the outer edge of the reach, running on minimal power, broadcasting nothing, simply watching and recording. Each element had a plausible civilian rationale. Together they formed something else entirely. The manufacturing platforms were the core of it. 8 of them, positioned at varying distances between Earth and the frontier, each capable of producing and outfitting warships at a rate that peacetime analysts had never seen reflected in any public budget. They had been funded through a combination of legitimate defense appropriations and what Makoa's team had simply labeled infrastructure investment in budget documents, a characterization that was technically accurate, if incomplete. The ships themselves were a different philosophy from anything humanity had publicly fielded. Human warship design, from the earliest frontier patrol vessels forward, had optimized for speed, communication redundancy, and sustained operation in isolation. Ships that could reach a problem fast, assess it without support from home, and execute a response without waiting for orders that would take hours or days to arrive at the speed of light. The doctrine was rooted in necessity, interstellar distances made real-time command impossible, and had produced, over decades, a naval tradition of independent captains and decentralized decision-making that was deeply embedded in fleet culture. The Horizon Fleet took that philosophy and extended it to its logical endpoint. Ships designed not just to operate independently but to function as cohesive tactical units without centralized coordination, using tight beam passive networking to share sensor data and tactical assessments across a formation without any signal detectable from outside the formation's immediate perimeter. Command distributed across 3 captains in any given group, any one of whom could lead if the others were lost. Weapons systems designed for sustained engagement rather than first strike shock. A deliberate choice based on the assessment that any conflict with the Veth would not be won in a single engagement. There were 340 of these ships. The Veth Alliance, as far as fleet intelligence could determine from 4 decades of careful observation, had approximately 700 to 900 active military vessels of various classifications operating within and around the corridor. Humanity's fleet was outnumbered. That had been understood from the beginning, and it was precisely why the Horizon contingency had been built around strategic patience, attrition resistance, and a specific operational concept that Makoa had spent years refining. He called it the long accounting. The idea was straightforward in principle, brutally difficult in execution. Humanity could not win a short war against the Veth. The Veth were older, more numerous, and operated on home territory they had controlled for thousands of years. A direct clash, fleet against fleet, in the outer corridor would be a loss. But a long war, fought on humanity's terms, with extended supply lines protected by dispersed logistics platforms, with attrition campaigns designed to deny the Veth the ability to consolidate control over the Reach, with hit-and-fade operations that never gave the Alliance a fixed target to destroy, was a different calculation entirely. Humanity had something the Veth had not encountered in their long history of managing their corridor, a civilization that had evolved, biologically and culturally, to absorb catastrophic loss and continue functioning. Every human civilization that had survived into the modern era had done so through periods of collapse, disease, war, and rebuilding. The capacity for organizational resilience under sustained stress was not something humanity had engineered into itself. It was something history had selected for. Makoa had written, in a planning document that very few people had read, "We are not the strongest civilization in this corridor. We may not be the most advanced. But I believe, with high confidence, that we are the most difficult to break." The Horizon contingency is designed to test that belief. On the day the Kepler Reach went silent, that test began. The activation sequence for Horizon took 48 hours to complete. Ships dispersed across the inner corridor and mid-reach began low-emission transit toward assigned staging positions. Manufacturing platforms shifted from maintenance mode to active production. The sensor network along the outer edge of the Reach, which had, it turned out, recorded everything, began transmitting its archived data to fleet operations. The reconnaissance probes hadn't arrived yet. But humanity already knew more than the Veth likely expected. It knew the composition of the forces that had moved through the Reach. It knew their transit vectors. It knew, approximately, where they were now. And it knew something else, something the sensor network had captured in the final hours before the colonies went dark. Something that Makoa's analysts spent 3 days confirming before he reported it to the Council. The Veth had not destroyed the colonies. There had been no mass-energy weapons discharge, no signatures consistent with orbital bombardment. The sensor data showed a pattern consistent with something different: forced evacuation or forced relocation. The colony's infrastructure appeared, based on what the sensors could detect, to be substantially intact. 1.2 million people. Missing but possibly alive. That changed the calculus in ways that were simultaneously hopeful and deeply complicated. "They cleared the corridor," said Admiral Makoa, standing before the Council. "They didn't annihilate it. That's either a restraint we didn't expect, or leverage they intend to use." He let that sit for a moment. "Either way, it means we have time. Not much but some. And I intend to use it." The first probe came back on day 11 as calculated. It wasn't supposed to come back at all. Reconnaissance probes of the type fleet used were one-way instruments, small, fast, disposable. They flew to their target, passively observed for a programmed duration, then transmitted a compressed data burst on a tight, encrypted beam back toward the nearest relay. They had no return propulsion. They had no survival expectation. This probe had been damaged. Something had struck it, not a weapon, analysts determined, but a debris field, probably remnants of a destroyed relay station. The impact had knocked out its transmission array before it could send its burst. In a remarkable piece of engineering luck, the collision had also partially restored its maneuvering jets, which had then, following their last programmed instruction set, attempted a return trajectory at low thrust. It arrived spinning slightly, leaking propellant, carrying 11 days of passive sensor data from the outer edge of the Kepler Reach, data it had never been able to transmit. The recovery team that intercepted it worked for 36 hours straight to extract and decode the stored records. What they found was extensive, detailed, and deeply sobering. The Veth Alliance presence in the Reach was not a raiding force. It was not a punitive expedition. The sensor data showed infrastructure, large-scale, pre-positioned infrastructure that had clearly been placed in the corridor in stages over a period that analysts estimated, based on construction signatures and material weathering, at somewhere between 8 and 12 years. Orbital platforms. Depot structures. Relay systems using frequencies that did not overlap with any of humanity's communication bands. The Veth had been preparing this move for a decade. Possibly longer. That realization landed heavily in the operations rooms of every fleet hub simultaneously. 8 to 12 years. The diplomatic engagement had continued the entire time, slow, careful, seemingly earnest exchanges of mathematical concepts and spatial maps and cautiously offered data on respective stellar territories. And beneath it, or alongside it, the Alliance had been quietly assembling the infrastructure to make this corridor move possible. It raised a question that divided fleet analysts and diplomatic staff into sharp camps. Had the Veth been negotiating in bad faith the entire time? Or had the decision to clear the Reach been made later, by a faction within the Alliance that had overridden whatever understanding the diplomatic track had been building? The distinction mattered enormously for what came next. A unified Alliance decision was one strategic reality. A factional decision, made by some members over the objections of others, was a very different one. Captain Zainab Ferretti of Fleet Intelligence had spent 9 years studying what little was understood of Veth internal politics. She presented her assessment to Admiral Makoa in a 90-minute closed briefing, and her conclusion was carefully hedged but pointed in a specific direction. The Alliance is not monolithic, she said. We've known that for years. The 7 civilizations that make up the Alliance have different relationships with the corridor, different resource dependencies, and almost certainly different views on how to handle a rapidly expanding species on their border. The infrastructure we're seeing in the probe data was expensive to build and expensive to conceal. That kind of commitment requires internal consensus. But consensus within the Alliance doesn't mean unanimity. She paused. What I can say with reasonable confidence is that at least 2 of the 7 member civilizations, the Seraph and what we've been calling the third vocal, based on signal pattern analysis, have historically maintained the most communication with our diplomatic teams. They responded fastest. They asked the most questions. If there's a faction within the Alliance that opposed this move, those 2 are the most likely candidates. Can we reach them separately? Makoa asked. Not with our current communication architecture. They communicate through Alliance relays. We've never had a direct channel. Then we need one. That became one of 3 parallel priorities in the days following the probe's return. The other 2 were operational: the positioning of Horizon fleet assets in the mid-corridor for the long attrition campaign Makoa had designed, and the beginning of what the operational planners called Shadow Reentry, a program to begin quietly re-establishing human presence at the Reach's inner edge without triggering a direct engagement. Shadow Reentry was the most immediately dangerous piece. It involved inserting small teams aboard minimally detectable vessels, converted survey ships, most of them with stripped-down profiles, into the corridor to establish sensor posts, map the current Veth disposition, and if possible, make contact with anyone who might have survived or been left behind on the colony worlds. 14 ships volunteered for the first Shadow insertion. Fleet accepted 6. The selection criteria were brutal. Ships had to have crews who understood they were operating without rescue capacity. If they were detected, no extraction was coming. They were too far out, and initiating a rescue operation would compromise the positioning of assets that the entire Horizon strategy depended on. Every crew member signed a statement acknowledging this. Fleet did not ask for volunteers twice. The 6 ships departed on a staggered schedule, 3 days apart, taking separate routes toward the inner Reach along trajectories that kept them in the gravity shadows of larger objects as much as possible. They ran cold, minimal power output, no active sensors, navigating on preloaded charts and dead reckoning. It would take them between 25 and 40 days to reach their assigned positions, depending on route. Meanwhile, the Horizon fleet assets continued their quiet convergence on staging positions. 340 ships, moving in small groups of 3 to 7, using low-emission transit protocols, saying nothing. From the outside, from the Veth sensor net, if it was as sophisticated as analysts estimated, the inner corridor probably looked quiet. Humanity had gone still. That stillness was not fear. It was the specific, practiced quiet of someone who has spent a very long time learning how to wait. On day 17 after the Reach went dark, the Colonial Defense Council convened its first full public session since the crisis began. The statement released afterward was brief. It confirmed that contact had been lost with frontier settlements in the Kepler Reach. It confirmed that the cause was believed to be external action. It did not use the word war. It said that humanity was assessing the situation with all available resources, and that the safety and recovery of frontier citizens was the primary objective. It was, in the careful language of crisis communications, completely accurate and almost entirely uninformative. The public response was what crisis communications teams had modeled: anxiety, anger, and, this was the part that the council had counted on, a kind of deep, collective steadying. Humanity had been through crises before. Severe ones. The institutional memory of how to function under existential pressure was not academic. It was lived. Support networks for frontier families activated within hours. Relief organizations began coordinating. Research teams redoubled work on faster communication methods that might give the shadow insertion teams some form of contact with the relay network. And in fleet operations, Admiral Makoa looked at the slowly updating map of Horizon assets moving into position and allowed himself one private assessment. The Veth had cleared the frontier in 4 hours. Clean, efficient, decisive. Whatever they had used, whatever forces they had committed, it had been overwhelming at the local level. But they had not come further in. They had stopped at the edge of the reach and gone quiet. That restraint told him something important. They were not in a hurry. They believed they had time. He intended to make sure that belief was incorrect. Fleet doctrine had a concept it called presence communication. The idea was simple and old as naval strategy itself. You don't always respond to a threat with a weapon. Sometimes you respond by making your capability visible in a way that forces the other side to recalculate. A fleet positioned at the edge of contested space, doing nothing hostile, saying nothing, simply being there, that was a message with a specific and legible meaning. The problem with using presence communication against the Veth Alliance was that humanity didn't have a guaranteed read on what the Veth would see or how they would interpret it. Captain Ferretti had spent 9 years trying to understand Veth decision-making frameworks, and her honest assessment was that she had incomplete information. Some things seemed consistent. The Alliance valued consolidation over rapid expansion. They moved deliberately. They appeared to calculate risk across long time frames rather than reacting to short-term pressure. They had demonstrated patience. The decade of infrastructure building in the Reach was evidence of that. What she could not fully determine was how they would respond to a direct, visible military presence at the edge of their newly acquired corridor. There were 2 risk scenarios. First, they would see it as provocation and respond aggressively, initiating the fleet engagement that Horizon was not yet positioned to handle. Second, they would interpret it as confirmation that humanity was preparing for open conflict and use that as justification for moving further into the inner corridor, preemptive strike logic. Either outcome was bad. The alternative was what Makoa chose: presence without clustering. Instead of massing the Horizon assets at the Reach's inner edge in an obvious defensive formation, he dispersed them, small groups of 3 to 5 ships positioned at irregular intervals across a broad zone, deep enough inside the mid-corridor that they couldn't be characterized as a frontier-edge provocation, but positioned in a way that any Veth sensor sweep of the corridor would show human military assets distributed across a vast area. The message it was meant to send was not, "We are here to fight." It was something more specific and more unsettling for a calculating adversary: "We are everywhere, and we have been here longer than you realized." The mathematics of clearing a corridor shifts dramatically when you don't know where the other side's forces actually are. On day 23 after the Reach went dark, something unexpected happened. A narrowband transmission arrived at the innermost relay station in the Kepler network, the one station that had not gone dark, positioned just at the boundary of the cleared zone. The transmission was in a signal pattern that fleet xenolinguistics recognized immediately as Veth in origin. But it was not from the Alliance's standard communication frequencies. It was from the third vocal. The message was short, composed in the mathematical pidgin language that decades of careful contact work had produced. Imperfect, ambiguous in places but functional. Xenolinguists worked on it for 6 hours before presenting a translation to Makoa. It said approximately, "This action was not our choosing. We have lost internal capacity to alter its direction. We offer the following: the people you call your frontier are preserved. They are held at coordinates we will transmit separately. We cannot stop what is moving toward your inner systems unless the balance of the coalition shifts. We ask, can the balance be shifted from your side?" The room where Makoa read the translation was very quiet for a very long time. Several things were immediately clear. The third vocal was acting outside Alliance consensus, likely at significant risk to itself. The use of a non-standard frequency suggested they had been planning this communication for some time and had prepared a route that would not be easily traced by Alliance monitoring systems. And the phrasing "what is moving toward your inner systems" was alarming in a very specific way. Something was coming. Not yet in the mid-corridor but in transit. "What are they asking us to do?" asked Council Liaison Director Chinwei, who had been present for the translation briefing. Captain Ferretti answered before Makoa could. "They're asking whether we can give them something to use. Political leverage inside the Alliance. Something that makes the faction that ordered this look like it overreached. that made a move that's going to cost the Alliance more than it gains. And how do we do that? We don't hit them hard enough to give them a war they can rally around, Ferretti said carefully. We hit them precisely enough that the cost becomes visible to the members of the Alliance who didn't want this. We make the overreach expensive without making it existential. Makoa nodded slowly. Targeted attrition. The infrastructure they prepositioned in the Reach. It cost them a decade of resources and political capital to build. If we start dismantling it, quietly, precisely, avoiding casualties to the maximum extent possible, we create a situation where the faction that made this move has to explain to the rest of the Alliance why the corridor they promised would be cleared and controlled is, in fact, a sustained liability. It was not the aggressive, decisive response that some on the Council had been pushing for. It was slower. It was harder to sell to a frightened public. It required the operational crews executing it to show extraordinary precision and extraordinary restraint at the same time. But it was the only approach that did three things simultaneously: demonstrated capability, avoided full escalation, and gave the third vocal something to work with inside the Alliance. Makoa made the call. The shadow insertion teams, now approaching their positions in the inner Reach, received updated orders. Target priority, infrastructure. Specifically, 3 of the largest preposition logistics depots that the probe data and subsequent sensor analysis had identified. These were not combat vessels. They were supply nodes, enormous, expensive, difficult to replace quickly. Their loss would not be militarily decisive. But it would be deeply felt, and deeply visible to every member of the Alliance evaluating the corridor operations cost-benefit ratio. The insertion teams had orders to approach, assess, and if conditions allowed, if the depots were unmanned or minimally staffed, if collateral risk was acceptable, execute precision strikes using munitions designed to disable rather than destroy. Make the infrastructure non-functional. Leave it intact enough that the cost of what had been lost was clearly visible. It was the most difficult kind of military operation, one constrained by political objectives rather than tactical ones. 3 weeks later, the first insertion team, the survey vessel Kessler, under Commander Adiz Obi, reached its assigned position and began its assessment. What they found around the first depot changed the plan. Not because the depot was defended, it was lightly by 2 patrol-class vessels that Obi's team successfully avoided. But because, anchored to the structure's lower docking ring, were 17 human cargo transport frames. Not warships. Not military assets. Civilian transports. The kind used for large-scale population movement. And they were not empty. Obi transmitted a compressed burst to the relay network, knowing it would take days to arrive but unable to wait any longer. Her message was 8 words, stripped to essential content. Civilians aboard infrastructure target. Request amended orders. Awaiting. The Reach's population wasn't at some distant holding facility. They were being kept, it appeared, within the Alliance's own new corridor infrastructure. Mobile, dispersed, impossible to target without risking the very people humanity was trying to recover. It was an elegant and cruel arrangement. Whether it was intentional leverage or an incidental consequence of how the Alliance had organized its operation was impossible to determine. The effect was the same. Makoa received Obi's message on day 41. He sat with it for 12 hours before he responded. When he did, his amended orders were precise. No strikes on designated targets. Maintain shadow position. Begin mapping of all civilian transport locations. We are changing the objective. The war, if it could be called that yet, had just become significantly more complex. There is a specific kind of military planning that has no good name in any doctrine manual. It is not rescue. It is not assault. It is not negotiation. It is the slow, careful process of extracting a population from a position of leverage without triggering the collapse of the very diplomatic thread that is your best chance of avoiding a larger war. Admiral Makoa called it, in the operational documents, progressive recovery. His planning staff called it, in the privacy of their own working sessions, threading a needle in the dark. The intelligence picture had clarified considerably by day 50. The 6 shadow insertion teams had successfully mapped the positions of 31 civilian transport clusters distributed across the Reach's inner region. Together, these clusters held an estimated 1.1 million people, not all 1.2 million, which meant approximately 100,000 remained unaccounted for and were presumably at locations the insertion teams had not yet reached. The transports were not prison ships in any conventional sense. Power signatures indicated life support, heating, food processing capacity. Preliminary passive sensor analysis of internal electromagnetic signatures suggested normal human physiological activity. People sleeping, moving, generating the electromagnetic footprint of ordinary human life in a confined space. They were not being harmed as far as could be determined at distance. But they were also not free, and they were positioned, whether by design or convenience, as human shields around infrastructure that the Alliance had spent a decade and enormous resources establishing. The third vocal had transmitted twice more since their initial contact, both times using the same non-standard routing. The transmissions were fragmentary, suggesting increasing difficulty in communicating without detection. The clearest element of the second transmission was a time reference. The third vocal indicated that whatever was moving toward your inner systems would reach the mid-corridor within approximately 40 of their temporal units. A measurement humanity's xenolinguists had established, through years of careful comparison, corresponded to roughly 55 to 65 standard Earth days. That was the deadline. 55 to 65 days before something. A fleet, presumably, though size and composition were unknown, reached the inhabited inner corridor. Before that happened, Makoa needed to accomplish three things: recover as many frontier civilians as possible, make the cost of the corridor operation visible to dissenting Alliance factions, and position Horizon Fleet assets for whatever engagement was coming without triggering a premature confrontation. None of these objectives could be prioritized over the others. All three had to be pursued simultaneously. The plan that emerged from 6 days of intensive planning sessions was organized around what Makoa called the three instruments: Shadow, Signal, and Steel. Shadow was the insertion teams, now expanded to include a second wave of 11 vessels that had completed transit to the Reach. Their mission was immediate and dangerous: approach the civilian transport clusters and attempt direct contact using frequencies the colonists would recognize, standard emergency broadcast bands, which the insertion teams had been given specific authorization to use in a burst-only minimum signature mode. Establish communication, assess conditions, identify which clusters had the best extraction potential, and prepare a coordinated extraction sequence that could be executed across multiple locations simultaneously to prevent the Alliance from using one recovery as a trigger to move others. Signal was Captain Ferretti's domain, the careful construction of a communication to the third vocal that gave them what they had asked for, specifically, documentation of the civilian transport arrangement, prepared in a format that could be presented to the broader Alliance as evidence that the corridor operation had taken a form that implicated the entire Alliance in something its less aggressive members had not agreed to. Holding civilian populations as infrastructure buffers was not, as far as human diplomatic analysis could determine, something the Alliance had done before. It was an escalation that the third vocal could use. Steel was the Horizon Fleet itself. 340 ships, now largely positioned across the mid-corridor in Makoa's dispersed formation. Most of them would stay where they were. But 36 of them, the fastest, the ones with the most capable sensor packages and the best profiles for close-approach operations, were assigned to form an outer perimeter around the extraction zones in the Reach. Not to fight. To be seen. To make unmistakably clear that any Alliance response to the extraction would be occurring in the presence of a human military force that had been there, undetected, for weeks. The perimeter ships had strict rules of engagement: observe, record, broadcast. Under no circumstances initiate fire. If fired upon, withdraw on a prescribed trajectory that moved away from the civilian clusters. The goal was not to provoke a fight. It was to demonstrate that humanity had been operating in the Reach all along, that the cleared corridor was and always had been a fiction. The extractions began on day 56. Commander Obi's ship, the Kessler, initiated the first contact burst at a cluster holding approximately 34,000 people from 3 of the agricultural colonies. The response, when it came 17 minutes later, was a voice transmission. A woman's voice speaking standard colonial dialect, with the specific cadence of someone who had spent years on Kepler 9, one of the grain stations. She said, "We've been waiting. We didn't know if anyone was coming." The Kessler's crew did not transmit a voice response. They transmitted a terse confirmation code and a countdown to extraction initiation. Over the following 19 days, insertion and extraction teams working in coordinated sequence recovered 847,000 people from the civilian transport clusters. The operation required extraordinary precision: approach, dock or close enough for transfer, load, withdraw, transit to a collection point 3 light hours inside the mid-corridor where Horizon support vessels were waiting. Each extraction team was alone in its sector, making independent decisions, with no real-time coordination possible across the distances involved. They operated on shared protocols and individual judgment. They lost 2 ships. The survey vessel Ansari was detected during an approach to a cluster near one of the larger Alliance logistics nodes and received weapons fire before it could withdraw. Its crew of 11 were killed. The research conversion Delacroix suffered a drive failure during transit and was unable to maintain its prescribed withdrawal vector. It was boarded by an Alliance patrol vessel and its crew, 9 people, was taken aboard the patrol ship. Their fate was unknown. The Alliance's response to the overall extraction operation was not the immediate military action that planners had feared as the worst case. It was something more measured, a general withdrawal of the civilian transports toward the inner reach's defensive positions, which complicated the final third of the extraction sequence and left approximately 280,000 colonists still aboard transports that were now positioned too close to Alliance military assets for the extraction teams to safely approach. The third Vocal's third transmission arrived on day 68, past the outer edge of the original timeline. It was the clearest communication yet, suggesting that either the routing security had improved or the third Vocal had decided that the risk of clarity was now worth taking. The transmission said, "The coalition is divided. The evidence you provided has created the discussion we needed. But the faction that ordered this move has responded by accelerating the inner corridor force. They want a result before the discussion can conclude. You have less time than we told you. Approximately 20 of our units, not 40. 20 Veth temporal units. Roughly 27 to 30 Earth days." Makoa received this on day 68. He had 30 days. The 280,000 still aboard the transports. The incoming fleet. The 36 Horizon ships in the Reach perimeter. And 304 more positioned across the mid-corridor, waiting. He made his decision in 20 minutes. All Horizon assets, new orders. Active transit to the following coordinates. We are no longer waiting for them to come to us. We are going to meet them, and we are going to make very sure they understand what meeting us means. The fleet began to move. The engagement that would eventually be designated the Battle of Kepler Transit, the name came later from historians who needed something to put in records, did not begin as a battle in any clean, conventional sense. It began as an observation. The incoming Alliance force, which fleet sensors as it crossed into the mid-corridor, resolved into approximately 180 vessels of various classifications, conducted its transit in a standard deep space formation that Ferretti's analysts recognized immediately as optimized for intimidation rather than combat. A broad, visible front. Spacing that maximized sensor profile. The kind of approach that, in Veth historical context, had almost certainly preceded political capitulation by smaller civilizations on dozens of previous occasions. It was, Admiral Makoa understood, a show of force designed to end a confrontation before it became a fight. He had spent 30 years thinking about this exact moment. The Horizon Fleet's formation when the Alliance force resolved it on their sensors was nothing like what they would have expected. It was not a defensive line at the mid-corridor boundary. It was not a massed fleet preparing for a head-on engagement. It was something the Alliance had no historical reference point for. 340 vessels distributed across a volume of space roughly 14 light minutes across, positioned at seemingly random intervals, their emissions, for the first time since Horizon activation, fully unmasked. Every ship broadcasting its presence simultaneously. The effect on the Alliance formation was documented by the Kessler's passive sensors, which had rejoined the main force after completing its extraction runs. The incoming force slowed. Its formation tightened, not an aggressive move, analysts noted, but a protective one. The instinct of a force that had just realized the space around it was occupied by something it hadn't known was there. Makoa transmitted a message to the Alliance force on every available frequency, in every communication format that 40 years of contact work had produced. The message had been drafted by Ferretti and refined over 3 days of careful language work. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was an accounting. It said, "The people you removed from the frontier are being recovered. The infrastructure you positioned in the corridor has been assessed and documented. The evidence of how that infrastructure was used, the civilian populations held within it, has been provided to members of your coalition. We are here. We have been here. We are capable of the sustained presence you are now observing, and we have been building that capability for 30 years. We are not asking you to surrender. We are asking you to stop, to halt the advance of this force and allow the diplomatic discussion within your coalition to conclude. We have communication with members of your coalition who did not authorize this action. We are prepared to wait for that process to complete. But we will not allow this force to move further into our systems. That is not a threat. It is a fact about what we are prepared to do. There was no demand for an immediate response. The message was transmitted and then the Horizon fleet simply held its position. All 340 ships. Distributed across 14 light minutes of open space. Saying nothing further. The Alliance force stopped. Not a tactical withdrawal. Not a reorientation. It simply stopped advancing and held position. 180 ships, uncertain, in a corridor that had just revealed itself to be far more occupied than their intelligence had apparently indicated. The pause lasted 11 hours. Then something happened that none of the planners had modeled for. A single vessel separated from the Alliance formation. Small, fast, and broadcasting on the third Vocal's recognized signal pattern. It moved toward the edge of the Horizon formation, not toward Makoa's command ship, but toward the Kessler, which was one of the insertion vessels and carried Captain Ferretti, who had transferred aboard during the extraction phase to be closer to the operational front. The vessel stopped at close range, close in stellar terms, roughly 40,000 kilometers. Close enough for relatively low-latency communication. And it transmitted. What it transmitted was long. Ferretti's team worked through it over 4 hours, and when they were done, Ferretti came to Makoa with an expression that he would later describe as the particular look of someone who has just found out they were approximately right about something very difficult for a very long time. The third Vocal's vessel carried two things. First, an offer. The remaining civilian transports, the 280,000 colonists still held, would be released to human custody immediately if humanity agreed to a communication halt and a formal joint session with the full Alliance Council, including the factions that had ordered the corridor operation. Not a peace treaty. A conversation conducted through proper channels with all parties present. Second, and far more significant, the third Vocal had succeeded in calling an emergency session of the full Alliance Council. The documentation that Ferretti's team had transmitted, the evidence of the civilian transport arrangement, the demonstration of the Horizon fleet's extent and capability, the record of everything the shadow insertion teams had observed and documented, had shifted the internal debate within the Alliance in a way that the third Vocal believed was now irreversible. The faction that had ordered the corridor operation had promised the Council three things. A cleared route through the Reach that would be secured and held at low cost, a demonstration of the Alliance's capacity to manage expansion-related challenges before they became strategic vulnerabilities, and a result achieved before any significant human military response could materialize. None of those three promises had been kept. The corridor was not cleared, humanity had been operating within it throughout. The cost, in terms of the political capital now being spent managing the internal fallout, was significant. And the Horizon fleet's visible presence had demonstrated, in the most direct possible way, that a significant human military response had in fact materialized, had been building quietly for 30 years. They overcommit to a result they couldn't deliver, Ferretti told Makoa. And now the rest of the Alliance is holding them accountable for it. Makoa looked at the Alliance force on his display. Holding position. Not advancing. Do we accept the offer? I think we have to. The 280,000 are still out there. And a council session, a real one with all factions present, is something we've been trying to get for 40 years. Risks? The faction that ordered this isn't going to disappear from the Alliance. Whatever we negotiate, they'll still be there. We'll need to build something durable enough that their future attempts are constrained by the precedent we set in this session. Makoa nodded. Then, for the first time in what felt like a very long campaign, he allowed himself a moment of something close to relief. Not because the hard part was over. He was experienced enough to know it wasn't. But because the specific outcome he had been working toward, demonstrating capability without destroying the possibility of diplomacy, had, at least for now, held. He transmitted the acceptance response to the third Vocal's vessel himself. Then he ordered all Horizon ships to maintain their positions. Not to withdraw. Not to advance. To simply remain where they were, distributed across their 14 light minutes of open space, a permanent and visible reminder of what the Alliance had walked into. The response had worked. Now came the harder task of making sure it lasted. The joint council session with the Veth Alliance took place over a period of 19 days, conducted through relay translation at the inner edge of the Kepler Reach, the point where humanity's communications infrastructure met the edge of what the Alliance had claimed. It was not a comfortable process. It was not designed to be. Admiral Makoa attended the first 3 days and then handed the diplomatic lead to Director Chinwei and Captain Ferretti, who were better suited to the sustained, detailed, often maddening work of building an understanding across the kind of civilizational gap that 40 years of careful contact had only begun to bridge. Makoa went back to his command ship and spent those 19 days doing something that most people who knew him would have found deeply characteristic. reading reports, updating doctrine, and writing. What he wrote was a planning document. Not a victory assessment. Not an after-action review in the conventional sense. A planning document for what came next. Because what had happened in the Kepler Reach, the clearing of the frontier, the extraction operation, the battle that had not quite been a battle, the council session, was not an ending. It was the establishment of a new baseline. A new understanding, however imperfect, of what the relationship between humanity and the Veth Alliance actually was. The outcome of the council session was, in the careful language of the joint communiqué released on its final day, a framework for territorial recognition and structured engagement in the Kepler corridor. The frontier colonies would be returned to human administration. A demarcation line would be established, not a wall, not a prohibition on movement, but a defined boundary with agreed protocols for transit and activity on both sides. The Alliance faction that had ordered the corridor operation was not named publicly, but the communiqué included language about accountability for unilateral actions, that, Ferretti explained later, had teeth within Alliance internal politics even if it looked like diplomatic boilerplate from the outside. The 280,000 colonists who had still been aboard the transports were released as agreed, joining the 847,000 already recovered. The total recovery was approximately 1,127,000 people out of 1,200,000. The remaining 73,000 had not been located in time and remained, per the terms of the framework, a subject of ongoing communication. The Alliance stated that they were alive and would be repatriated through the agreed protocols. Humanity's diplomatic teams and humanity's public had to decide how much weight to place on that assurance. It was not a perfect outcome. It was a real one. What did not change? The Horizon fleet remained deployed. Not at maximum operational density but maintained. The manufacturing platforms continued production at a rate that would sustain and gradually expand the fleet over the coming decade. The sensor network that had watched and recorded everything in the outer reach was upgraded, expanded, and hardened. The shadow insertion capability, the quiet, patient, high-skill work of operating in contested space without a safety net, was formalized into a permanent fleet branch. These were not preparations for the next war. They were the recognition that the condition of security is not achieved once and then held forever. It is sustained through sustained effort, and the moment you stop sustaining it is the moment the calculation begins to shift against you. There was a question that a journalist asked Admiral Makoa at his first public press conference after the crisis, 3 months after the joint communiqué, when the evacuation ships had returned most of the frontier colonists to their homes and the first reconstruction teams had landed on the 11 affected worlds. The journalist said, "Admiral, the Veth had been watching the Reach for 40 years. They knew approximately how many ships humanity had publicly fielded, what our public defense budget was, how our frontier was structured. They made what seems like a reasonable assessment, based on available information, that they could clear the corridor without triggering a significant military response. Were they simply wrong about the available information?" Makoa thought about the question for a moment before answering. "They were right about the available information," he said. "They were wrong about what information was available." It became one of the more quoted lines from the crisis period, because it captured something that was true and important about how the situation had unfolded. The Veth Alliance had not made a stupid miscalculation. They had made a reasonable one based on what they could observe. The problem was that humanity had spent 30 years ensuring that what could be observed was not the whole picture. The Horizon contingency was not a bluff. It was a deliberate and sustained effort to ensure that any adversary's assessment of human capability was systematically incomplete. That was not deception in the conventional sense. It was operational security applied at civilizational scale. The distinction mattered. The frontier colonists who came home to damaged infrastructure, disrupted lives, and the particular complex grief of people who had been moved against their will through a situation they hadn't asked for and hadn't been able to influence. The reconstruction took years. Not all of them chose to return. Some resettled in the inner systems, closer to family, closer to the density and safety that proximity to Earth's gravity well still represented in the human imagination. But many did return. More than statisticians had predicted. The Kepler Reach, whatever had happened to it, was home to people who had chosen it and who found, after everything, that they still chose it. On Kepler 9, the grain station, the woman whose voice had answered the Kessler's contact burst. Her name was Anya Voss, a second-generation agricultural technician who had grown up on the station and had managed, during the months of displacement, to keep detailed records of everything she observed about their conditions, their captors, and the other colonists around her. Gave a brief interview in the station's restored common area, 6 months after her return. She was asked whether she had known that rescue was coming. She thought about it. Not known, she said. But I believed it. My grandfather worked construction on one of the relay stations when the reach was first being settled. He always said, and I never really understood it when I was young, that the people responsible for us out here weren't naive. That they understood what it meant to put 1 million people 340 light years from home and that they took it seriously. She looked around the common area, repaired, functional, full of the particular warm noise of people eating and talking and existing in proximity to each other. I think he was right about that. Admiral Makoa retired 22 months after the crisis at 60 years old, having held fleet command for longer than any officer in the service's history. His retirement statement was 4 sentences. The last one read, "The work of the past 30 years was not the work of generals. It was the work of engineers, linguists, logistics specialists, survey pilots, and the people of the frontier who chose to live at the edge of what we know. I had the privilege of trying to be worthy of their trust." The Veth Alliance continued to exist, and continued to be the dominant power in the Kepler corridor. The relationship humanity built with it over the following decades was not comfortable, not simple, and not remotely free of tension. The faction that had ordered the corridor operation remained part of the alliance, constrained but present. But the framework held. Not because it was perfect, because both sides now understood, with a clarity that had not existed before, what the consequences of abandoning it would be. Humanity had demonstrated something in the Kepler reach that no diplomatic message could have conveyed as effectively. Not dominance. Not invincibility. Something more durable and more credible than either. The capacity to endure, to plan across generations, and to respond to the worst assumptions anyone made about them with something those assumptions had never accounted for. Not a miracle. Not a surprise. 30 years of quiet, patient, deliberate work. The galaxy slowly was learning what that meant.